what I want to talk to you tonight about is risk, the probability, statistics, likelihood, if you will, of something bad happening. And I want to bring to your attention a risk that very few people are aware of that has serious consequences, and it is the risk of getting risk wrong. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We are often more afraid of some risks than the evidence says we need to be. And we are just as often not as afraid of some risks as the evidence says we ought to be. That's what I mean by getting risk wrong, when our fears don't match the facts. And to help you remember this phenomenon, because it puts us all at peril, myself included, I've given a name, this risk perception gap. That's what I call it. And I want to impress upon you tonight briefly, A, that it exists, and B, why, because it comes from an awful lot of innate features of our human cognition, so that you can be aware of it and aware of how it works and hopefully mitigate some of its dangers. We have made incredible discoveries in the last couple decades. You're probably aware of many of them, about how human cognition works. And a lot of them, to me, support the wisdom of satirist Ambrose Bierce, who said in the Devil's Dictionary 100 years ago, point, they'll leave it there, that, if you can read it, the brain is really only the organ with which we think we think. Let's let that settle in on you bright TED audience people. Right. We have this pride, this belief, this fealty, this worship of reason. But most of what's going on up there right now in me and in you in this audience and out there and all of us all the time is subconscious. It's instinctive. It's emotional. It's beyond our free will. And nowhere is this more true of risk. So let me race through what 4 fields of cognitive study have taught us about why we have certain, I'll call them flaws, but I don't want to be too negative, certain realities about human cognition that keep us from always getting the facts right about risk. We get it right most of the time, but sometimes we're wrong. The first one is, point it that way, I'm learning. There's one thing I want you to notice about the slides, even if you can't read them. There's a word on the left that says subconscious, and it's in red. You'll see the list build up. It's going to be a whole bunch of studies of cognition that are subconscious, and they're all going to be in red. Not perfect reason. The first field is neuroarchitecture. It's how your brain is built. And for that, I want to talk you through a couple pictures of the brain itself. There are 3 parts of the brain that matter for fear. The outer wrinkly part, which is the cortex, where, among other things, we think, we reason, we consciously, purposefully think. The thalamus, down in the middle, which is 2 things for this fear response. First, it's the first place that stimuli go in the brain, go when they get into the brain, from external senses, from internal thoughts or memories. Okay? It also then acts as a relay. It doesn't process the information much. It just sends it on. It's hardwired to other sections of the brain, which then do their thing. And the third part that matters is this little part down here called the amygdala. I hope you've heard of it. You really want one of these. We have a right one and a left one, and I hold up my thumb because it's about as big as the top knuckle of our thumb, and it's where fear starts. It's where it sends out a signal that we call the fight or flight response, and then it turns into the conscious expression of fear. So now I want you to imagine something with me. I want you to imagine you're walking down a path in late afternoon, and there are a lot of tree roots, those little thin tree roots that you're walking over, and there's a swamp on either side of you with lots of gushy reptile things in there. And out of the corner of your eye, before you're consciously aware of it, your brain catches sight of one of those little lines, and maybe it just slithered. Right. I can hear what just happened. And if I could see your hands, I'd ask you to raise your hands, but you probably had some sort of a, could be a snake response. So let's see if I can do this quickly. Watch the screen. You see this. What do? Does anybody want to see it again? Too bad. Because think about it. If you want to take the time to look at it and it's a poisonous snake, does that work in evolution as a trait for your risk perception? Or do you win a Darwin Award? You're stupid enough to be out of the gene pool, and that's good news. So what happens is, stick, I see this on a beach in Iceland. I give this talk all over the world, and I startle. You can't undo this. Here's what happens in the brain. The optic nerve carries the signal up to the thalamus, the little part that's glowing there in the middle, which acts like a relay, and it sends the information on to the places that it's hardwired to. One I've highlighted is the prefrontal cortex behind your forehead. That's where we think, do purposeful, conscious decision-making. And one is the amygdala. Look at which one is closer. Because the amygdala is right next to the thalamus, it's the first place that the thalamus's relayed message gets to. The amygdala does not wait around for more data. The amygdala says, ah! Right? That's the instinctive response that you had in this audience to this little game that I'm playing. Those red lines are the fight or flight response, turning up or down the systems we need or don't need to waste energy on while we're fleeing the lion or fighting off the lion. The information still hasn't gotten out to the forehead, to the prefrontal cortex to think it over. It's still traveling that way. And then it gets processed by the prefrontal cortex, and the cortex gets to kick in. So here's the first biology headline about risk perception. Our brain is hardwired to feel first and think second. How's that for reason? But you would say, of course, reason has a chance to kick in. This is in the first parts of a second, right? Yes, absolutely. But if you can see it, there are 6 red lines going out from the amygdala, and there are 3, here are the facts, calm down. Now you have the data, let's be reasonable lines coming down from the cortex into the amygdala. And this slide summarizes what Joseph Ledoux, who is the NYU scientist who has helped pioneer this research, says in his wonderful book called The Emotional Brain. At this point in evolution, because of the way the brain is built and operates, emotion and instinct readily and easily overwhelm conscious, purposeful reasoning. Not just at first, but in an ongoing way. How's that for reason? The question then becomes, line 2, how does the amygdala know to be afraid of nuclear power or climate change or industrial chemicals, or the things that we're probably not born afraid of? We might be born afraid of snakes in the dark and things that may have a genetic root that's controversial, but we're not born afraid of many of the things that we are asked to figure out. Well, it turns out that we've developed what are called by the academics heuristics and biases, which is the fancy way of saying we have mental shortcuts to make quick sense of partial information on the fly before we have a chance to get all the information, or go to Google and look up all the information, or have all the PhDs we need to understand all the information. That's not how life works. We'd better have tools to make quick sense of partial information that might be dangerous to us. So we've developed a bunch of these mental shortcuts, heuristics, and biases. This is the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and others. And here's one. So I was looking around before this began at what this building is made of. And this is true. There is an invisible, odorless, industrial chemical in the air that you're breathing right now that is bad for your health. Let me say that again, and while I do, please all take a breath of this air. Invisible, odorless, undetectable, industrial chemical bad for your health. Now, I will ask you, I'll look through the lights, raise your hand if that troubles you at all, gives you any kind of a worrisome sort of a reaction. Okay, you don't have all the information, do you? About what's the chemical, what does it do to you, what's the dose that you need for it to do harm. One exposure, lifetime exposure, you don't know. But I asked you to make a choice. That's what life is always doing. And here's how you made it. You used what's called representativeness bias. Long-winded way of saying you had a hint, industrial chemical. You searched for all of what you already know to see what that hint represents. This is stereotyping with people and countries and all sorts of things, but you're making sense of that partial information, industrial chemicals, against what you already know. What does it represent? And lots of psychological literature says that if I ask you what's the first word that comes to mind, if I just use the word chemicals, which is kind of crazy because we're made of chemicals, but we're really talking about industrial chemicals, but if you just say chemicals, bad, dread, cancer, death, all kinds of bad. So I noticed that a bunch of hands went up, worried about this air. Don't worry, the dose is too low. You're safe. There are a lot more of these heuristics and biases I have to barge on for time. A third area of psychological study that explains why this risk perception gap happens, why we're more afraid than we need to be based on what the body of evidence suggests at this time, or not afraid enough, it works both ways, is The study by Paul Slovik, who's a friend of mine and a supporter and a great guy, and others who have found that risks have personality traits. They have psychological characteristics that make them feel more or less scary, the facts notwithstanding. So let me give you an example of that. In this environmentally conscious Thoreau, did I say that right? Thoreau? How do you say it now? I'm going to make sure I get it right. Town, environmental issues are particularly poignant. So as I was thinking about this talk, here's an example. We're more afraid of risks that are human-made than risks that are natural. Same risk. Want an example? I have lots of friends at my liberal, Unitarian, Universalist First Parish Church who are, to some degree, afraid of the risks of cancer, from radiation, from nuclear power, and nuclear power waste. Okay? Raise your hand. Are you concerned about the risk of cancer from radiation from nuclear power to any degree? Okay, this is cool. Even more than my colleagues in the front row are raising their hands. It's a good sign. I bet that most of you who are concerned about nuclear power have very little problem going out into the sun for more than an hour without protecting your skin from carcinogenic radiation from the sun. Way riskier. Melanoma from the sun kills as many people in America as are murdered per year. Way more. But it's natural. Here's another reason why the sun doesn't scare us as much as radiation from nuclear power. We go out into the sun voluntarily to garden or walk or hike or kayak or just do our errands. But we do not voluntarily ask for the cloud to come over from Fukushima or the particles of radioactive fallout to come from atmospheric nuclear weapons testing and put strontium in our milk cows in Vermont. Oh my God. The risk of that is minuscule, tiny if there's any one at all, but it feels bigger because it's imposed. A risk that's imposed feels bigger, scarier, more worrisome than the same risk if we take it ourselves. That feels right. And I'm not saying this is wrong or irrational, but you can see how that can lead you to judgments that don't match the evidence and dangerous behaviors, like me not putting on sunscreen, and I've had skin cancer on my face twice. Okay. There are other psychological characteristics, but for time I have to barge on. I barge on. We argue, if I asked you what's your opinion, let's say about climate change, let's use another environmental issue, we would talk over that issue and you would argue it, you would support your issue based on the facts. The ice cap in Greenland is melting and the Arctic and the seas are rising and extreme weather is happening and it's getting warmer, and all of that is absolutely true. But in fact, what we do with most of our perceptions of all things, including risk, particularly risk actually, is we select those facts that allow our view to agree with those in the groups that we most powerfully identify with. So our opinion gets along with our friends. I go to this liberal church. I wouldn't stay friends with a lot of people too long if I had a whole lot of really arch-conservative views, and vice versa. So what Daniel Kahan and others have called is cultural cognition. I urge you to learn more about this. We selectively pick those facts that allow our views to agree with those in the groups that we most strongly identify with. Now, why is that part of risk perception? We're social animals. If we're a member in good standing of the tribe and the lion's attacking, maybe the tribe helps me survive. If the tribe is shunning me because my views are anti-tribal, I'm lion chow. Right? We have evolved to be exquisitely aware of social acceptance. The fear of public speaking is about the fear of social rejection. It feels threatening down in the amygdala. Social rejection is dangerous. And if our tribe agrees with itself, everybody agrees in the tribe, our tribe does better in its combat with other tribes for how society operates. You know, this argument about how Republicans are all agreeing and Democrats are all fraction, that's what this is talking about. So our views on risk are colored by all four of these things. And again, you notice that the color red, subconscious? Ah, thank you. Now we can think. Now the facts come in. Now, of course, they're mixed in all the time in an ongoing sort of way. But do you remember the slide I showed you about the amygdala? The be afraid lines, the 6 red lines, the instinctive how it feels lines going out, and only 3 coming back from reason. Reason carries only so much weight in how we think these things through. This leads to dangerous choices. The danger of the perception gap, summed up, which is the purpose of this talk, are threefold. It can lead to dangerous personal choices. I have a friend, a 55-year-old male, who has forsworn lots of seafood to protect himself from mercury. Maybe some of you have. He is too afraid of mercury. It turns out mercury is not a risk to adults. Most of the science, almost all of the science on mercury is that it has a minimal, actually, effect on the healthy cognitive development of the fetus and young infants, but not a lot of them are eating seafood, right? Swordfish for dinner for your 3-month-old. Okay, so mercury's not a risk to him, but for a number of reasons, he's afraid of it, and he's forsworn this fish. This fish is rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which are good for his risk of heart disease, which as a 55-year-old male, he's 2 strikes against right there. That's dangerous misperception of risk because of these factors. There's a second factor here, chronic stress. A fight or flight response turns systems up or down in our body, which changes our body chemistry and systems. Your heart beats faster so that your blood circulates. Well, if that lasts for more than 2 weeks, that sets you up for cardiovascular damage. It depresses your immune system, which you don't need when you're fighting the lion or running away. And the more worried you are about getting sick from an infectious disease, West Nile virus, the more likely it is that you will get sick if the mosquito bites you. Chronic stress is bad for our health in lots of ways, and worrying more than the evidence says we need to is one of the sources of that stress. There are lots of studies on post-9/11 effects on New Yorkers, having greater cardiovascular damage, infectious disease damage. The greater they say they were freaked out by those events. Finally, the policies that we choose as a society, and this is the closing thought. When we all fear the same thing for the same kind of emotional characteristic reasons, the evidence too, but also how it feels to us, we ask the government to protect us from what we can't protect ourselves from, right? So here's one. We can't protect ourselves from the biologically active substances that major companies turn into drugs and feed us. So we have uber regulations on those, right? The FDA, maybe not enough, but we test them for 10 years in clinical trials and all that sort of stuff, in part because that's a man-made risk, right? But we don't have nearly the same constraints and regulations in clinical trial and pre-market testing of natural drugs, biologically active substances that we put in our bodies to change our bodies and repair our health, right? Which do wonderful things, but some of them have side effects that are bad for us. We're less afraid of them. They're natural. We've regulated them less. We're at greater risk. We spend far more on cancer research than on heart disease research. Both need equivalent amounts of scientific research, according to my scientific friends. Heart disease kills 60,000 more of us a year. These policies are representations of the perception gap. So in sum, the perception gap is real. It has serious consequences to our personal choices, our personal health, and our social choices, not only human, but also environmental. And we can, A, recognize it, and B, know, because we know how it works, we can know that we can counteract it with an open mind, more information. Take a little while to think things through. Don't just have a knee-jerk reaction to when you hear the next chemical, oh my God, it's bad. Get sources that you wouldn't necessarily always agree with. Challenge your emotions. We can do something about this risk if we recognize it's real and we know how it works, and now you do. Hope you're healthier.